There's one or two occasions when the entire city gets flooded. We had two clients actually. One was a client who was donating the money. Thank you to the organizers at ELEV8 for inviting me for this. It's always a pleasure to come to Ahmedabad, and uh, we spent our formative years of architecture in this city, and we have a very strong kind of emotional link with this place. And then, of course, being in this building itself is something exciting. It's always nice to come to the Milonas, and personally, a building which has influenced me a lot. So, what I'll try to do is, sort of, there's a selection of projects. I think there are about 8 projects that I'll sort of run through, which in some ways I think may sort of represent some broad kind of trajectory of the kind of work that we're doing. So 2 of them are older projects of a smaller scale. Then there are 2 ongoing projects which are still at site and not yet complete, but I think they are of a different level of scale and complexity, which I would also like to talk about. And then there are some, over the last 10 years, a few of our sort of institutional projects which have actually been completed. So, this was this Rishi Valley School. It's a project that we got very early and at a time when we didn't have much work, and there was a parent whose kids were studying there, and they actually donated this building to the school. It's kind of it's on a 400-acre property, largely forested, and it's part of the Krishnamurti Foundation, which has a very kind of a Spartan kind of a philosophy about life. And you can see this building on the left. These are the typical buildings which exist on the campus, very kind of frugal and nice. There's also Kadapa stone there, which is it's in that region of Andhra Pradesh, which is commonly kind of used. So it's kind of funny because there's all these. It's a very high quality school, but you get a lot of privileged kind of children who come there eventually and can sort of pretend to be poor for a few years before they go back and get along with life. So it's so this was the building that was that we were asked to do was the senior girls hostel as a dormitory project. And so over here we had this kind of very complicated relationship with the clients. We had 2 clients actually. One was the client who was donating the money and and who selected us as architects. And then there was the school, so each had their own agenda. The client wanted a certain kind of a aesthetic, and which they came to us, but the school had its own kind of priorities in terms of what they wanted out of the project. So it's a senior girls hostel, so there was a lot of, so there's this tension between creating something which is closed and at the same time something which is set in a very beautiful kind of natural setting and wanting to sort of open out towards it. So so it's a very kind of simple, it's a sort of a cloister kind of a plan, and would have been a simple courtyard, but for an existing building which was there. And the way it works is that you have a cluster of 4 dormitories, each with 4 students, and then they have another building which is part of this complex, which is what they call a house parent. So a small 2 families live along with the students. And so we created and there was from the school side there were very worried about the safety of the girls. One, you know, being adolescent girls, they were very kind of protective. So they almost wanted us to make some sort of a fortress. And, in terms of the entry and the visibility and things like that, so boys should not be able to come inside. And so this whole thing about supervision and this sort of commands a view of the whole courtyard. It's kind of so they there is sort of no movement that can happen there without the sort of supervision. So, but then outside you have it's all kind of wooded and uh, so we, so on the one hand you create this kind of community space which is within the courtyard, but the rooms themselves, the dormitories, are sort of open on both sides. And so on one side to the community area and then into the forest outside. And this was also one of the projects where we started working with these kind of layered facades, which combine various functions. Sometimes they have, there's the typical, there's the weather protection, there's security grills. Sometimes there's some kind of utilitarian kind of elements that go into those layered kind of facades. So it's a kind of a theme which continues in a lot of the projects after this. Yeah, so this is a kind of, so we did this kind of screen, which is a combination of this slate, again, a locally available material, and a kind of a steel grill. And it sort of consolidates the facade into kind of a simple element. So this is the kind of, this kind of indirect entry. So even when the door is open, people from inside can't get a view of the courtyard inside. And these are the two kind of house parent units, and the dormitories are sort of behind. And and very simple kind of interiors of the house parent apartment. Again, open on both sides. One side opening out into the courtyard. Sometimes a study space. You have to, again, this play between openness and privacy. So you want to actually get light in there, but at the same time prevent some views in this particular location towards the girls' kind of wash areas. And there's a sort of a rainwater, it's an area where there's a lot of water shortage. So the entire rainwater is collected, but it sort of becomes an element in the courtyard. And so you see that kind of layered screen, which is, sort of dominates that courtyard element. And this kind of becomes a community area for the students. Again, the washrooms and, fairly, simple kind of dormitories, which are kind of, again, just open on both sides and fairly Spartan. And then, of course, this long facade, which is there, the double layer facade. So interestingly, this double layer. So you have this total control from inside, but the outer part, there is this double layer facade where actually it's the only area we realized where they don't have, they cannot be observed. So all the stuff that they're sort of not supposed to do happens here. So in the night, they can move between dormitories and, do all the stuff that is not allowed. And that's that facade overlooking the forest. So this is, again, a very small project that we did around the same time. It was just a primary healthcare center in Dharmapuri, in Tamil Nadu. So it's actually, not about 18 kilometers from Dharmapuri town, and it serves about 4 or 5 villages in that vicinity. Provides basic kind of healthcare in terms of doctors and some testing facilities, etc. So people don't have to actually travel to the town. So here again, another theme that we've been sort of working on, which is basically like a building within a building kind of an idea, and we've done it in several projects. And actually, a lot of it comes from this building itself, which is that big box with a lot of objects inside. So it works very well in terms of even a climatic situation, being very hot, extremely hot and dry in this area. So basically, you start with the idea of a outer envelope and a inner core, and which is surrounded by a buffer layer, and then of course this becomes a rectangle which is eccentrically arranged, so you get a variety of kind of spaces around, and in section the same thing sort of happens. So you basically have this small core building within the larger building. So uh, so again, this was built at a very, very low cost. So what I did was that the inside building was a proper sealed, secure building, which could be built to a decent kind of a spec, completely secure. You have the consulting areas again, which are open on both sides, and well ventilated. Uh, um, you have a pharmacy and a lab and basic kind of services, and a comfortable kind of a waiting area which opens out to the landscape, service area behind, doctors area behind. And then I think because we had a little bit of saving from all the kind of measures that we were taking, we got a sort of a little bit of an extra space, which was a community kind of a gathering space, where they hold kind of public health programs and things like that. And this place itself is called Devara Udu. Sorry, or the Devara Udu Palam, which means God's own spring. So there is a history of that place actually, of kings coming to that area, and of some sort of springs where they visited. So this idea of water as a life-giving element, and this is actually built by a sort of a Christian trust. So the idea of water as a life-giving element was important. Yeah, so it's basically a very straightforward kind of. There's a plinth, kind of a large plinth which is there, and then you have the core building which is a conventional kind of RCC structure with an RCC roof which has that big gutter which collects the rainwater and puts it out into a water element there, and also stores it. And then a very light steel frame which is built on the outside, which has these kind of lowered panels which are made of this vetiver grass, which is called it's khas, which so you can wet that, and it creates this sort of evaporative cooling effect. So this was a very economical kind of outer layer, so the outer building, and then of course a GI sheet roof on the top. A lot of the stone was gathered from it's built on one agricultural plot, so a lot of the stone, when you clear the site, actually you gain it, so you construct the plinth out of that. And these kind of screens which are there, the roof, a lot of the services are kept on the top, so that you don't need to kind of get light, even for the service areas, and in the gap between the two roofs. And of course this so this is the kind of small gathering space that you get in the front, which is used for a lot of events. And the waiting areas, which you can control the amount of light that is sort of coming, or the amount of protection that you want. And of course there are different kind of situations depending on the time of the day or time of the year. This was at the opening. So yeah, so this was again something, again it's part of a family of a theme, of this kind of layered facades, and actually sometimes using the space between the two layers, rather than it just becoming an insulation kind of layer. So then I'll just jump to what's happening, currently, just go through two larger kind of institutional kind of projects. So this is it's a large science museum which is being built. It's almost finished. It's in Patna in Bihar. So it's the largest science museum in India, probably one of the largest in the world. It's about 4 lakh square feet, and on a 20-acre site, which is in the middle of Patna city. So this was won through a competition, and these are government projects. For our client is the government of Bihar, and uh, so there are a series of projects which were won through competitions, and are of a public nature. So this is one of them. So actually, when I went for the pre-competition site visit, it was, I fell asleep on the flight, and when I woke up, it was we were flying over the Gangetic Plain. You could see it was a post-monsoon. There was water collecting in various areas, and before you knew it, you were sort of hitting the the Ganga, and with these brick kilns there. And then as you cross the Ganga, you could see these tracts of, in these islands where you have this kind of agricultural, uh, uh, temporal kind of agricultural practices. And then you cross the Ganga and you reach that's Patna over there. And as the plane sort of banked into its sort of flight path, I actually noticed that we could see the site from the window. So our site was actually there. So it was actually an interesting, um, so this thing of this whole waterlogging and the site itself being a sort of a low-lying waterlogged site. So that night, I kind of spoke to some friends who, landscape architects who are in Philadelphia, Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna, and just told them about the site because I knew that they had been I sent them these photographs, and so then they got very excited and said, you should maybe look at this. And and they sent me some material on, this whole. Dilip was writing a book about some of these monsoon kind of landscapes, and then then from that, I sort of so we discovered this whole thing of it in these kind of areas where you have, the monsoon kind of, uh, very heavy monsoon and flooding which happens. So the traditional settlements are usually on some kind of mounds, sort of a high ground which is created, sometimes artificially, so you kind of raise, and it's called the Janapada. So in a sense, it's kind of another meaning of Janapada, which is kind of where the person sets foot. So it's kind of a foothold. So it's creating a kind of high ground. And then what happens really is that the settlements are built on the high ground, and then there is this fluctuation in the kind of level of water all around. But so there are places which could be wet all the time, like the actual path of the river, and then there are places which sort of are wet some of the time and dry sometimes, and then there are the actual settlements which remain dry all the time. So, and along this kind of, while this kind of variation happens along the gradients, there are all kinds of agricultural practices that happen, which keep shifting as the season changes from wet to dry. So this became a sort of a starting point for the project, and our site, again from that point where this is it's sort of a panhandle kind of a configuration. And again, as you can see, it's completely waterlogged, so it's in a low-lying area. It was completely filled with garbage. The stadium out here, the access is from one point here, and then there is this Nalla which runs. It's called Saidpur Nalla, which is completely full of sewage and garbage. Not a very pleasant kind of a site. And as you can see, the site does retain water over a longer period of time, even when it's not raining. So then, from the kind of inputs I got from these landscape architects, uh, I sort of sent them a sketch which said that maybe the site can be something where you divide it into a low ground and a high ground along the periphery, and then the low ground is accommodate some kind of water system and a plantation, and the museum is on the high ground, and you have the kind of movement where visitors come in and service around. So then when you look at it, so this kind of divides it into a sort of a low ground, high ground kind of situation. And so then it really becomes sort of two projects in one. So there is what we proposed in the competition was, one, the museum, of course, which was part of the brief, but we also sort of proposed a sort of a public park, which we initially wanted to have as a through and through a thoroughfare, but which did eventually happen. So there was two parts to this project. And then of course, how the museum actually works. So it becomes a sort of a finger, this interlocking fingers of landscape and building, uh, the high ground with the museum itself and the low ground, which is the park. And then of course, you have this sort of the circulation that happens, the visitors come in, and you have the service which kind of wraps around the whole thing. And then just to kind of explain the program very quickly, you arrive at an atrium, and then you have some of the core programs around uh, the permanent exhibition on one side, temporary, and then a lot of public functions. And then of course the back of house and other kind of program which supports. So there's a huge kind of infrastructure that goes into even in terms of the back of house of a museum. And interesting also that they provided dormitories over here, so students who come from school kids who come from outside Patna can stay there if they can't return the same day. uh, and then so we are a little bit so you arrive here, and then you have one loop which is sort of, you cut through all the exhibition halls, and then you go to another level, or you could go to that level at various forms. So there are many loops you can make. So you go to the upper level and come back to the same place, or you come out into the landscape and the park, which is also an exhibit, a scientific exhibit in itself, and loop back here. So, I mean, without getting into all the details, see these exhibition halls are really, um, completely black box exhibitions. So these are all in terms of the brief coming from the museum experts. So black box exhibitions. So there are one, two, introductory hall, and then four large halls. Each hall is about 1,800 square meters. It's pretty massive. Uh, so you arrive at the stadium. I mean, at the museum in this atrium, and then you sort of move across there, and you have so there's a introductory, be a scientist, and basic sciences, space, and they're all themed, yeah, and but you sort of cut across these halls actually, rather than having a sort of a system where you have an independent corridor. You're actually cutting through the halls there. So you go. So what we've really done is that you have these huge halls with a lot of exhibits. Like 1,800 square meters is something you probably can't even do in a day. So you may breeze in and out of one and out, and it's an overload of information. But at every point, you come out to a vestibule which sort of opens out into the landscape. So there's this kind of an alternation of this kind of hermetic, sealed, dark space, and then coming out and this release into the landscape. So that's very broadly, and you have services and other support facilities at each in each sort of bay. So the other part is, of course, the low ground, which is that entire from the approach and over here, and about the park. And then the theme that was worked on was this idea of the forest and water. The water as a theme, which was there at the start of the project. And then there was this aspect of agriculture, which was actually part of the chief minister's kind of brief, saying that there should be pride in architecture, I mean in agriculture, and that somehow that should be included in the museum itself. So the landscape was sort of based on these three themes, and so then this whole idea in terms of flood mitigation, so the site was sort of used to demonstrate a flood sort of mitigation strategy for the city. The Patna gets flooded, every monsoon there is one or two occasions when the entire city gets flooded. And this being a low, so the idea being that in every site you have low ground which can hold water, so there is a amount of retention that happens within the site itself before it sort of overflows into the sort of municipal system. And so if every site is, rather than just removing all the water from your site as quickly as you can, you retain part of it. So it basically retards the whole process of discharge. And then, of course, this is very beautiful sketch by Anuradha Mathur. Unfortunately, she passed away during this project, and it sort of gives that sense of how the kind of integration of this sort of forest kind of grid, and then these different types of you know, agricultural kind of practices and cultivation which are demonstrated in this low ground. And then it's also organized as a series of kunds, you know, so there is a, you know, a stepped kund here, a ramped kund there, an irrigation tank there, and there's a system of, you know, retention and then overflows from one to the other. And then there's this entire thing which is a sort of a biotic cleansing system. So the entire, initially we had proposed that even this nalla could be worked on, but of course that was cancelled by the client. So the entire sewage treatment of the museum is done here to a very high degree, and it's all very beautiful and has plants and all that. So it's a fairly elaborate landscape kind of project, a lot of consultants, landscape consultants, and then we had, you know, plant specialist, you know, Pradeep Kishan, who from Delhi, who has this sort of expertise in terms of, you know, indigenous species. So he selected the whole plant palette, you know, something which is, you know, not commonly found in sort of nurseries, and it's something which would become a sort of a educative kind of a part of the museum project. And of course, then we just converted that into a, you know, the concepts that they gave us, translated into a very intricate kind of landscape project. And of course, it's still, we've not documented. There are just some vendors of, you know, this amphitheater and these kind of. So there's an upper courtyard where the vestibules kind of open out into, and then steps. And then we sort of you don't see the fire driveway which is there from inside, and it sort of steps down to the lower park area. And these are the vestibules, and this one of the kunds. You get an overall idea. I mean, you get a sense of the landscape proposal from here. So, you know, these are the kind of the halls, and then these vestibules, this upper courtyards, the driveway, and then this series of kunds, amphitheater, and the three kunds, and the whole biotic plant. This was done, very nice model done by an intern, Visishta. You know, sat on it for 1.5 months without getting up from her desk, and totally focused on it. So a lot of challenges in terms of this project, government project. It's been going on. We won the competition in end of 2017, started construction in 2019, and it's still going on, you know. So a lot of compromises, I think, in terms of the way maybe the construction happened, but the bones of the project are intact, and you know, so it will still function in the way that it's meant to, but maybe without the kind of constructional kind of finesse that we would have liked. So coming closer to, to Ahmedabad, this was another competition for student housing at IIT Gandhinagar. Okay, and so actually we had taken part in a competition for student housing in IIT Gandhinagar in 2014 or 15, and we thought we had done quite a good proposal, and we were expecting to win. You know, we had seen, but surprisingly we were out, and so then it was a bad. You know, we were not. We were disappointed and forgot about it. And then about 9 years later, they sent us an RFP for the next phase of the student housing. You know, and we submitted basically the same entry. You know, and which was actually adapted to a new site, and we won it. So that was very, 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 very sort of exciting. So this is the campus, and, you know, kind of a strange master plan, you know, which doesn't respond in any way to the river. And these are the existing kind of hostels, and this was the kind of sort of odd shaped parcel that we were given initially to accommodate about 1,500 students. There are a lot of the Vastu Shilp has done the staff housing here, and then HCP has done one phase of housing, and another architect from Delhi has done the second phase, which we lost the competition. That is here, you know. Uh, so here, actually, initially, I mean, the whole idea was, I think we were dealing with this idea of big and small. Okay, so this is the HCP kind of module, which is they have both these C-shaped and one or two closed, which is about 56, 60 meter kind of a footprint, and we were just wondering whether there could be a more a smaller grain to the project, in terms of, if what could be the smallest unit which could work with a central kind of an open space, or a central common area. So eventually we came to something which was workable, which was about 22 meters by 22 meters. uh, so which is a big contrast from from the what existed on the campus. So then we were also interested in this idea of how a module, or a small unit could occupy space. You how do you fill occupy the site with a module that repeats? So a checkerboard actually is a very efficient space filling kind of a pattern, because you get this kind of density, but at the same time it allows the maximum kind of distance between the buildings themselves. And then to increase the density, you sort of increase the overlap. And then also, meanwhile, during the competition, actually, we initially made three sort of clusters with diagonals and all that in the competition. But after the competition, they sort of changed the brief and asked for, actually, the student density was increased a lot. So from 1500, it went to about 2600 on the same site. So also there were the other requirements that the client came for, and we had some interesting. I think sometimes there were interactions with the students where we kind of presented the scheme, and an interesting kind of feedback that came. So it did evolve in a little bit different way from the original concept, which was over three clusters with some diagonals. Uh, so then this sort of as we sort of increase the density, we sort of splits up into these things. So you get the fire driveways over there, and the advantage of a fine grain kind of modular is that it can adapt to all the nooks and corners of the site. And then, of course, there's something missing. There are two dining blocks at these corners. And then again, because they had given us a target of certain area per student, which had to match the existing hostels, which was challenging for us because we actually had no rooms on the ground floor. We had all common facilities on the ground floor. uh, so eventually, to increase the density, we started connecting them with program, not just bridges. So then the small module actually became one kind of interconnected building. Actually, it's a single building, so which has about 2600 students. uh, so I think the interesting thing is that it's both. At one level, it is smaller than the existing hostels, but at the same time, it's actually a much bigger building. And there was a lot of sort of feedback from the students that we got initially in the discussions, and they wanted to be able to move freely from one to the other. And they're quite progressive, actually, at IIT Gandhinagar. So they didn't want any restrictions between the girls' hostel, boys' hostel. They said, in fact, they said it should be designed in a way that you can't do it. I mean, and so there's this, actually, the one cluster over here, this five, that's the proportion roughly, which is actually girls' hostels, and then there's this entire. Uh, so I mean, so this then becomes one kind of interconnected module with all these courtyards, and then you have the sort of vehicular movement that goes under these. And the other requirement from them was also to have shaded walkways, because it's so hot, and in these campuses to walk big distances is can be quite tiring. So the existing hostels made these kind of connections, covered walkways, but what we did was we really integrated it into the building. So with this overlap on the ground floor, you have these internal streets that run, and this is actually what connects to the rest of the campus. And then you basically, a cluster on the ground floor. Basically, you have all these common facilities, and you have a internal street. The entire residential part is lifted up with a sort of an atrium. You have a lot of community facilities, lobbies, sports, and things like that on the ground level, which open out onto the courtyards. And of course, so this kind of connectivity is very strong. In both directions, you can move in shaded areas. You have your cycle parking and all that. And even at the, so you can move from one, so we're also trying to mitigate the effect of doubly loaded corridors, even though you want to get sort of high density. So, but there are other programs that come in, and so you have the whole washroom thing there, and then you sort of move around in these areas, and you can actually move from, one block to the other and in all directions. So it's a completely integrated kind of a facility. At a broad, on the ground level, you have, the vehicular kind of movement which goes under the buildings, and this kind of shaded network for movement, and these kind of streets which run across with all the entrances to the, so there are 26 entrances, 26 blocks. So it's very convenient, from A to Z, they can name it. Yeah, so you get that sense of that whole. So it's both a single building and many buildings. And yeah, so it's under construction now. It's at the plinth level, but this is a sense of moving in that internal street at the bottom level, where you have these entrances to the hostel blocks, and then it keeps opening out onto these courtyards on either side, and this kind of thing of the courtyards and the street that runs under, which, so you have rooms, so bridging the streets. And I think that was also interesting, because you sort of break away from the idea of vehicular movement creating these kind of blocks. So actually, this was also a competition that we did. So, where we were lucky to qualify, because, they sort of relaxed the criteria. It was triple IT in Bangalore. So it was a competition for an extension of a floor. Okay. And the site is sort of in an electronic city. You have it's right opposite the Infosys kind of campus. It was an existing building which they had converted, industrial building which they had converted into their into this academic block. And this was the kind of roof that was available. They had a dome which reminded them of MIT and their inspiration, and then this kind of grid that was available. So we were adding a floor here. So again, now there's sort of this theme of this nature and sort of this opposition between nature and culture, or nature and urbanity. So on one hand, you want to connect with nature, the other hand, you want to bring people together. So there were these existing sort of light wells in the building. So we sort of created these terraces, and there is a lot of greenery around, which sort of connect to nature there. And then the program is wrapped around here, and you create an internal street with a sort of a raised kind of a perforated roof, which creates this kind of communal kind of space within the building. And so the roof is kind of the street is a sort of a perforated roof, and then it also, we broke away from the grid of the existing building, so this kind of shifts up and down, and these kind of portal kind of frames which trace that profile. So broadly, program is there. You have the street with the light coming from the top, and so we also proposing to them that all the buildings around are sealed glass blocks, but they did want air conditioning, which is really not required in Bangalore. But we allowed the provision that you could have cross ventilation, and from the light wells, air escapes out. So it's actually, you don't really need to use the air conditioning. And of course, with the roof, which looked like cheese, these places were initially all agricultural lands with vineyards. So we had proposed to have a kind of a vineyard on the on the roof. So it became a wine and cheese roof. So it's also a thing about the old and new. And in this case, we sort of, did the opposite of whatever was existing. The structure is exposed, and so this was a important kind of project for us because it allowed us some sort of entry into that institutional space. And the way the government kind of contracts, I mean, the RFPs are, you need to have certain qualifications. So this gave you a window to do some of the projects I showed earlier. The approach, and we sort of rebuilt the eastern facade. This kind of internal street which runs through, so you can get ventilation across these spaces. And this is a trace. So a lot of traces of the old structure which are there were left as it is. The old dome, which was part of their building, becomes a sort of a central area. And then so also Bangalore has this condition where the light changes a lot during the day, and it's sunny at one point and suddenly becomes cloudy. So it sort of records the changes of nature within the building. And again, this thing of connecting to the landscape. So the old English garden effect. So it's like an infinity pool. Those trees across are actually 200 meters away at the Infosys campus, but we create this edge of the building which gives the illusion of the landscape coming in, and these kind of courtyards which are there and thresholds. So this eastern facade where they had this pond which was there. So also quite challenging to do a building when adding to a building which is occupied. So this whole thing of old and new, and actually the logistics of executing something with a lot of constructional and safety kind of issues. So then after that they gave us another project, luckily without a competition, and this was they got 1.7 acres just adjacent to their land, and they wanted 600 rooms for student housing, and kind of a student center, food court, and things like that. So it was a very simple sort of odd shape kind of site. So we kind of and high density, so you couldn't avoid the doubly loaded condition, but we created a sort of an edge building which had this kind of open space, communal space within. So basically it's a generic 300 plus meter length with the expansion joints and certain elements like the common, the vertical cores, washrooms, and common rooms coming at a certain frequency, and also these kind of disruptions which to the doubly loaded corridor, double height kind of sky rooms, which then gets bent around to just occupy the site, and you get this open space inside. Smaller span structure below, and for all the public functions at a lower level. So the structure changes there. It's a fairly straightforward plan. You have these disruptions every now and then. So you have a open space, and you have two plazas over there, and then going down to the utility level where you have some of the kitchen and parking and all that. But you have this kind of two-level lower plaza and an upper plaza. And then, of course, from across, even though it's a fairly constricted space, you get these kind of vistas out. So coming down from the parking, and you can see the two plazas. Nice to have kind of dining areas which are kind of open on both sides and more linear, because the sound that normally happens in dining halls. So these overlooking kind of double height spaces. Yeah. So this is then a project which was very close to our office in Bangalore, and it's a sort of an organization that deals with, it's in a very poor kind of a neighborhood, so they have a lot of programs. There's a school, a children's home, a lot of children who lost their parents during the tsunami came here, and their houses. So there's a kind of an orphanage, children's home facility. Then they wanted, it's a complex kind of a program, actually. in a kind of a residential neighborhood with some of the existing buildings. Um, so it has a street on both sides, the main access being there. So there was this existing building. Some of the sheds were demolished. So they got this donation. It was their 50th. It was their silver jubilee, and they got money to add a new facility. So we also renovated the existing buildings and added this new one, still trying to retain sort of a courtyard there. So the school access is from one side, and there is a primary healthcare center also included in the lower level, which is accessed from the street behind. So in this case, the interesting thing was that there's a very complex kind of combination of functions. Starting with uh, you know a public function like the clinic, which occupies the ground floor. You get a veranda kind of space, and then a dining facility for midday meals and things like that. And then there's a prayer chapel there, and existing classrooms, a special needs center. So the thing is that the program, the more of the academic facilities on this level, and as it goes up, it becomes more of a residential kind of facility. There are dormitories for small children. There's a halfway home, transition home for girls who, when they leave the facility, they finally sort of live together. So that was really the challenge of how to, and also the program would keep changing, so because these are, so we had to devise something which was quite flexible in terms of changing things. So, what you see in the section, so you have the existing prayer hall and school, which we sort of renovated. You have the clinic, school, and then the children's home below, and then the access from both sides. And you still retain that sort of courtyard there. Uh, so we over here we started going with this kind of flat slab system because it allowed you to really basically a free plan with the structure being independent. So you could change the plan easily on each floor, and you didn't have to really worry about beams and grids based on a specific beam plan. And this is something we've done in a lot of projects after this. It just gives a lot of flexibility to the client because people change their program, frequently, and uh, so it's nice to have that flexibility. Again, this theme of this idea of a double skin, like in a veranda, but translated into a multi-storied kind of a structure. So it can have different possibilities. In this case, it sort of ends here, but sometimes it's just a double skin. Sometimes it becomes a social space. Sometimes it's movement. So that threshold kind of space between the inner, again, building within a building. So the rooms inside are completely protected and can be sealed, but you have an in-between space which is kind of lends itself to many types of programs. Also, these shots have, I think, allow good ventilation. I think it's a low kind of budget kind of thing. So I think they can wear their shorts for at least 5 years. Uh, so this is that courtyard over here, and there's also an existing baby home there, and uh, this is part of the children's home on the top. Uh, so you get these kind of interest, and also there's a lot of noise, visual noise in the neighborhood. So this kind of louver system. These are louvers which are fabricated. Uh, Not a product. So it sort of neutralizes the noise in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is also characterized by a lot of bright colors, in terms of the houses. So we sort of took that language in to the building. Some of these niches are to be occupied by some equipment. Uh, so this idea of this kind of liminal kind of space between inside and outside, and shadow and reflections. Um, I don't. This guy is not hanging from it. I think. Or yeah. Uh, so this is the last project, and it's something we finished recently. So we've been doing these schools and for this Azim Premji Foundation, which are all over different parts of India. We've done stuff in Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand, North Karnataka, basically a lot of backward kind of areas. And these we did two recently in Rajasthan. This is in Siroi, which was finished about a year back. Um, so it's actually a combination. Typically, on a 4-acre site, it's a combination of a K-12 school and a district institute where they have their teacher training programs which work in the larger region, and in this case also a guest house. So people who come from neighboring towns or when they are sort of training there, they can um, stay, for a couple of weeks. So it's kind of close to Sirohi town, and in a sort of, typically these are all in agricultural kind of settings, and you have a kind of also a view of the hills which are close by. So again, now again, one project influences the other. So we thought we would again look at this idea of the checkerboard in terms of the different program. And you start with basically an open space and a built area, which is a sort of a precinct, and then it sort of gets built up into a checkerboard pattern which alternates built and open space. And then really as a generic kind of idea, and then it sort of develops into each one takes its own kind of there is a structure within which it sort of each one gets articulated according to its own directions. So you get this kind of thing. And then also here what we try to do is we try to create this idea of a precinct within a precinct. So you have a core area, which is a shared facility of all the buildings, and then you create a precinct, which is all the main program areas, and then a lot of the utilities and other things go in an outer layer which sort of disappear. So you get this kind of layers within the project. And here we also explored something different because we wanted to use the stone masonry. And what we decided is, okay, you have the load-bearing structure, typically with thick walls. Then you have the frame structure. So what we did was sort of a hybrid, which uses, 450 or sometimes 600 thick stone on the outside, but it has a frame within. So you really need the flexibility inside. And then the structure becomes part of the insulation. It gives sort of depth for recessing your glazing and things like that. And also, it becomes the identity of the project. So this kind of cluster of 4 blocks with a central facility, which includes an open hall on the ground floor, a library. So that there is the primary school, a secondary school, a district institute, and the guest house kind of facilities. So broadly, that sort of structure. So you have these 2 levels of courtyards, which you have these courtyards in between the buildings, and you have their own, each has its sort of own open space within. And this is kind of, so, the section cut across there. And again, you're talking about, so this is the sort of inner layer, and you tuck in a lot of your utilities and parking and things on the outer layer, which is not visible from inside. And you have this dining hall, which is a multi-purpose hall, which is open on both sides. And this is the side where you get the view of the hills, library on top. So actually, this is the, this is secondary school entrance. So you have this kind of very open kind of a hall, which is actually quite nice and airy, and it leads on to a sort of an amphitheater, library on the top, which has a big skylight. This is from the playground, the primary school, typical interior kind of the corridor with, this Kota stone, and the periphery being all in the load-bearing masonry, which is a local sandstone. This is the courtyard, again, of the guest house, the part of the district institute. The district institute and its courtyard, and then there's a sort of a connection between that and the library. So I think, the guest house and amphitheater, which has, so basically you create this inner layer, which is kind of self-contained, and you really don't you don't get to see what is immediately outside, but you get the distant views. So it was also interesting to do a kind of cluster of buildings, and the idea that from one building you get, or from depending on what elevation you are, you get these kind of different views, and there's a sort of a conversation between them. So that was, I think, quite interesting, and the spaces in between in the cluster. Yeah. So so that gives broadly. I mean, this one I've not cancelled that; it's getting too long, and. So I think that gives a sort of a broad trajectory of what we've been doing, and the kind of challenges that we've sort of faced, and the way our sort of practice has evolved and continues, hopefully, to do so if our profession survives. Um, and so we are still in a process of moving forward, and not lost our appetite for continuing practice, despite the fact that we complain a lot. And so that's it. If you have any questions, thank you.
So, two questions. If anyone has it, please feel free to raise their hand.
It was too long. Hi.
Last project that you showed the students did. So the outer wall that you did was in the sandstone.
Yeah.
And was it the entire low building structure, the outer walls?
There are places where there are some columns concealed. There are places, not everywhere. Yeah. But by and large, it is. In some of the areas where there were larger spans, Yeah.
Hi, sir. This is Nandu. I practice
Hi.
in Chennai.
Hi.
Lovely listening to you. It's probably the third or fourth time listening to you. I just wanted to ask you, it's a very wide body of work that you've done, spanning over many decades. So, how do you kind of adapt to the changing environments in practice, and the kind of culture of practice that's changing, and how do you modulate your approach to suit the need of the times, and how do you stay progressive and
I'm not sure we're relevant.
far more
Yeah. No, I don't think there's any conscious kind of approach, because it's every project that you do, you learn something from it, and and like I said, there are more battles lost than won. So even if you look at things like competitions, it's maybe 1, 2 out of 10 or some point, at the best. So there's a lot of other stuff that happens. But yes, we are at a point. But I think that the main thing which concerns us is that whether the practice is viable economically, and that's the big question that we are asking ourselves. That are there ways in which we can adapt our practice, because this model obviously doesn't work, and and it's not. I mean, I don't think. I think finally we exist in a market and in an economy, and to stay relevant we have to be able to produce what is of value to people, and what people will pay for, so these are the questions that we're asking, but otherwise it's an evolution of, then it's your own architecture. There are certain themes that you continue and you learn and you evolve. Yeah.
Hi, sir.
Hi.
The work that you have is, I want to ask you one thing: that how do you manage your work, your health, and your family?
But still, I don't look healthy. No.
Look very young and healthy, and you feel like in our 30s, we feel like 40s. So yeah, like how do you manage so much of work?
There's a blood pressure medication which is there, which is very effective. So I don't think this profession is good for your health, actually. So, it's a lot of stress, because I think everything that can go wrong goes wrong, and then the financial stress is not a joke. So I mean, for the younger guys here, I think it's good if you figure that out. It's as important as everything else, because what you do should be worth paying for, right? I mean, and you shouldn't do things which have no value. I mean, like otherwise it becomes like a hobby, that you're doing only for yourself.